H minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Episode 1 of the Cold War Bunker, where natural sunlight, foods with limited shelf life, and any materials that are not reinforced are not welcome. Thank you for taking time to watch this episode today, and if you enjoy this, I would love to hear from you. Leave me a comment, write your thoughts, your questions, your sidebars, your snide remarks. We welcome all of them. My name is Ben James. Let's get into the bunker. The Doomsday Clock. Out of all the areas, topics, people, places, and events and times in the Cold War era where we could have begun, and very justifiably began with Episode 1 in any of those areas, I think that you would also be justified in asking the question, why are you starting with the Doomsday Clock? Some of you may not even know what the Doomsday Clock is, or you may have never even heard about it. And if you haven't, it's understandable. The reason I'm starting here is out of all the launching points, all of the possibilities, I think that this doomsday topic encapsulates the Cold War era so well. It's widely accepted. It's developed by those who are brilliantly educated in certain areas. It was developed to catch our eye aesthetically. It's primarily full of propaganda, full of rumor and innuendo, and it still carries on to this day. So I think it gives us a really good encapsulating overview of what the Cold War is. Now, we'll be taking 3 episodes to dive into the topic of the Doomsday Clock. Episode 1, this one, is going to be a look into the global and political side of it. Second one's going to be looking at the cultural and society aspects of the Doomsday Clock. And the third, which is going to be the bunker debrief. So in these first 2 episodes, what I'm going to be present to you is in short form being pulled directly from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They're the ones who develop and distribute the Doomsday Clock, and I'm going to be taking brief sections from their website, and that's what you're getting today. And I'm going to try to do so with as little personal thoughts, takeaways, sarcasms, and biases. But let's be honest, I'm not going to be able to completely refrain from doing that. But then, in the debrief episode, what I'm going to be doing is then I'm going to be laying all of that on thick and heavy as I do my takeaway portion of it. So, let's start by asking the question, what is the Doomsday Clock? According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Doomsday Clock is a device and a design that warns the public about how close we really are to destroying our world with dangerous technologies of our own making. The clock serves as a metaphor, a reminder of the perils that we must address as mankind, as a race, if we're truly going to survive on this planet. When the Doomsday Clock was created in 1947, the greatest danger to humanity came from nuclear weapons. Since then, it has evolved, and the Bulletin has considered since then the possible catastrophic disruptions from climate change, and climate change began to be part of the hand-setting deliberations in 2007. So as we're talking about this hand-setting on the clock, who is it that decides what time it is? Well, in the early days, Bulletin editor Eugene Rabinowitz, it's fun to say it with me, Rabinowitz, decided whether the hand should be moved at all. A scientist himself who is fluent in Russian and a leader in the international disarmament movement, he was in constant conversation with scientists, conversations with experts within and outside of governments in many parts of the world. And based on these discussions, he decided where the clock hand should be set, and then he went on to explain his thinking within the Bulletin's pages. Now, when Rabinowitz died in 1973, the Bulletin Science and Security Board took over the responsibility and has met twice a year to discuss world events and reset the clock as necessary. The board is made up of scientists and other experts with deep knowledge of nuclear technology and climate science, who often provide expert advice to governments and international agencies. They consult widely with their colleagues across a wide range of disciplines, and also seek the views of the Bulletin's board of sponsors, which also includes 9 Nobel laureates. So let's get into a few of the clock's statements since its conception in 1947. The clock starts running, and it starts running at 7 minutes till midnight. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists changes its format from a newsletter to a magazine. Remember that part. And the first cover of this magazine features a clock, both conceptualized and designed by artist Martel Langsdorff. At the time, Langsdorff was married to a physicist, Alexander Langsdorff, who worked on the Manhattan Project at the University of Chicago. The Manhattan Project was all about the development of the atomic weapons that were used in World War II. At first, the artist considered using the symbol for uranium, but as she listened closely to the scientists who had worked on the bomb, as they passionately debated the consequences of the new technology and their responsibility to inform the public, she felt their sense of urgency in this design. So she switched from the uranium design and she sketched a clock to suggest that we didn't have much time left to get atomic weapons under control. Now, self-admittedly, she designed it because it seemed the right time on the page. ... It suited my eye, so to speak. This purely aesthetic design later becomes known as the Doomsday Clock, one of the most recognizable and most lasting icons in pop culture to convey the urgency of nuclear danger. For decades to come, the clock's hands have moved up and back upon whether events push humanity closer or further from nuclear apocalypse. The clock later includes dangers posed by climate change and other existential threats. Skipping forward to 1949, we see that it moves to 3 minutes as the arms race begins. In the fall, at a remote site in Central Asia, the Soviet Union explodes a nuclear device, the design of which is eerily similar to that of the bomb that the United States used on Japan 4 years earlier. More on that in episodes to come. The Soviets deny the test because of course they do, right? But U.S. President Harry Truman shares the news with the American public about it, and the arms race begins, even though we kept our development of it really hush-hush.
Be very, very quiet.
The Bulletin explains, quote, "We do not advise Americans that doomsday is near. No. Don't expect atomic bombs to start falling on your heads a month or a year from now, but we think that we have reason to be deeply concerned and deeply alarmed and to be prepared for grave decisions in the years to come." So basically, we're not saying it's happening, but go ahead, grab your books, get out in the hallway, get under a desk, let's do a drill. In 1953, the H-bomb begins in development, and that moves at 2 minutes till. Over the opposition of many nuclear scientists, the United States decides to pursue the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than any atomic bomb. In October of 1952, the United States tests its first thermonuclear device.
Wow. I like history too, and maybe when this is all over, you and I can stop by the souvenir shop together. But right now, I want to find some rockets.
Obliterating a Pacific Ocean inlet in the process. 9 months later, the Soviets test an H-bomb of their own. Quote, "The hands of the clock of doom have moved again," the Bulletin announces. "Only a few more swings of the pendulum, And from Moscow to Chicago, atomic explosions will strike midnight for Western civilization. In 1960, cooperation, not confrontation, relaxes a clock a bit back to 7 minutes. Political actions belied the superpowers' tough talk of massive retaliation. For the first time, the United States and the Soviet Union seek to avoid direct confrontation in regional conflicts such as the 1956 Suez Crisis. Joint projects to build trust and dialogue between third parties also help to quell the hostilities. Scientists initiate many of these measures. They help establish the International Geophysical Year, a series of coordinated, worldwide scientific events intended to raise public awareness, where the Soviet and American scientists can actually interact with one another.
We're thinking.
What are you thinking about?
In 1963, we see a greater movement back of the clock as there is a rest from tests, which is interesting because after the near catastrophic Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and a decade of almost nonstop nuclear tests, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which ends all atmospheric nuclear testing. Yay! The treaty does not outlaw the underground nuclear testing, though. But it does represent the first instance of concrete progress in at least slowing the arms race just a tad. It also signals awareness between the two countries that they must work together in order to prevent a nuclear annihilation. In 1968, the clock moves back to 7 minutes. The Eastern world explodes. United States involvement in Vietnam intensifies. India and Pakistan battle over Kashmir in 1965, and Israel and its Arab neighbors renew hostilities in 1967. Worse yet, France and China develop nuclear weapons in order to assert themselves as global players. This combination of conventional warfare and nuclear proliferation causes the Bulletin's editors to move the clock's minutes hands towards midnight. If you're a Dumb and Dumber fan, basically you end that sentence with saying,
Our pets' heads are falling off!
The Bulletin recognizes that the possibility that these regional conflicts could flare into wider wars with the potential use of nuclear weapons. The clock is set at 10 minutes in 1969 as we witness a landmark agreement. Nearly all of the world's nations come together to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The deal is simple. The states with nuclear weapons vow to help the treaty's other signatories develop nuclear power if they pinky promise not to produce the weapons. The nuclear weapons states also pledge to abolish their own arsenal. Wink, wink. When political conditions allow for it. Wink, wink. Israel, India, and Pakistan all refuse to sign, but the Bulletin remains cautiously optimistic. Quote, the great powers have made the first step. They must proceed without delay to the next one then, the dismantling, gradually of course, of their own oversized military establishments. I wonder how that worked out. But in 1972, someone passes the SALT and the clock moves to 12 minutes. After more than 20 years of vying for arms, the United States and Soviet Union signed 2 treaties that attempt to curb the race for nuclear superiority in favor of rough parity between the superpowers. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, limits the number of ballistic missile launchers either country can possess. The Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty seeks to stop a race for weapons designed to shoot down an adversary's incoming nuclear missiles. SALT leaves the two countries with thousands, I repeat, thousands of warheads. And oh, by the way, they're pointed at each other. And the United States, big surprise, eventually withdraws from the ABM Treaty. It's only as good as the ink that's on the paper, right?
Sorry for the misunderstanding, everybody. In fact, I'm not even here.
In 1974, India joins the club. The clock moves to 9 minutes. South Asia gets the bomb as India tests its first nuclear device. Any gains that were thought to be made previously in armed control agreements seems like a mere mirage at this point. The United States and the Soviet Union appear to be modernizing their nuclear forces. Let's forget reducing them. Thanks to the development of multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs. Because of those, both countries can now load their intercontinental ballistic missiles with more nuclear warheads than ever before. Let's take this time and enjoy the sounds of an amazing cup of Goose Bridal coffee that's been made here in the Cold War bunker. Today's cup is a 20-gram pour of beans with 300 grams of water, resulting in a well-balanced cup of Miner's Medium Blend. GooseBridalCoffee.com. In 1980, there seems to be an accelerating drift toward world disaster. 7 minutes to go. The Bulletin begins its 35th year deeply concerned about the accelerating drift toward world disaster in almost all realms of social activity. Alongside their failure to advance the SALT Treaty negotiations towards disarmament, both the United States and the Soviet Union have been behaving like what might be best described as nucleoholics. That's the best line on their website, by the way, in my opinion. Crisis of resources, the spreading trend toward irrationality in the national and international conduct of many states and peoples, and the inability of the international institutions to contain political crisis move the hands of the clock ever forward. We've become completely unhinged, is basically what the Bulletin is telling us here.
What are you in for?
I'm doing a one-nighter for biting Ed the mailman. Guy was trying to cast a spell on me, you know, like a wizard or something.
Are you sure about that?
I don't know, maybe he was just waving.
In 1981, the minutes moved to 4. Reheating of the Cold War. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan in the United States both served to harden the U.S. nuclear posture. Before leaving office in January of 81, President Jimmy Carter pulls the United States from the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow and considers ways in which the United States can win rather than avert a nuclear war. Reagan comes in and intensifies the hawkish posturing by scrapping any talks of arms control and proposing that the best way to end the Cold War is for the United States to win the Cold War. America. In 1984, we see the clock move to 3 minutes as we experience stalemate in Star Wars. Pew, pew, pew. As U.S.-Soviet relations reach their iciest point in decades, dialogue between the two superpowers virtually stops. Quote, every channel of communication has been constricted or shut down. Every form of contact has been attenuated or cut off. And arms control negotiations have been reduced to a species of propaganda. End quote. This is what the bulletin informs the readers of. The United States threatens to provoke a new arms race by seeking a space-based anti-ballistic missile system because we can. And don't worry, like any good stormtrooper, all of those shots at the beginning of this section missed their target. In 88, protests yield progress and we move to 6 minutes. At the end of 87, the United States and Soviet Union signed the historic Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first agreement to actually ban a whole category of nuclear weapons. The leadership that's been shown by the United States President, Ronald Reagan, and the Soviet Premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, makes the treaty a reality. But, let's be honest, public opposition to U.S. nuclear weapons was really a big factor in inspiring it. In the 80s, both countries had increased the quantity and the deadliness of their intermediate-range missiles in Europe, keeping that continent in the crosshairs of the two superpowers. Nothing like being stuck between a rock and a hard place that's playing a game of nuclear chess, right? Am I right?
Calm down what? Huh? You think I'm a hothead like Manny?
No. You can be emotional, volatile maybe. Still, that's a far cry from...
You put egg on my house! I kill what you love!
Psycho.
1990 moves it to 10 minutes, double digits on the clock because of the lowering of the Iron Curtain. The fall of the Berlin Wall in late 1989 symbolically ends the Cold War. Between 89 and 91, one Eastern European country after another overthrows its Soviet-backed government, while Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev repudiates his predecessor's policies and refuses to intervene. These revolutions end the World War II ideological post-division of Europe and significantly diminish the risk of all-out nuclear war. Quote, 44 years after Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the myth of monolithic communism has been shattered for all to see. End quote, the bulletin writes. 1991 marks a fresh start, and with 17 minutes till. With the Cold War officially over, the United States and Russia begin making deep cuts to their nuclear arsenals. U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as START. This agreement greatly reduces the number of strategic nuclear weapons deployed by the two countries. Better still, a series of unilateral initiatives take most of the missiles and the bombers in both countries off hair-trigger alert.
What's going on?
1995, a close call moves the clock to 14 minutes. The year begins ominously when the Russian military mistakes a U.S.-Norwegian scientific rocket for a nuclear missile, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin comes to a decision point of whether to launch a nuclear attack on the United States or maybe not. You see, that incident helps bolster the case made by U.S. hardliners that a resurgent Russia could be as much of a threat as the previous Soviet Union. Hopes diminish for a large post-Cold War peace, and more than 40,000 nuclear weapons remain worldwide. That's right, 40,000. Concerns arise that terrorists could exploit poorly secured nations' nuclear facilities within the former Soviet Union. In 1998, we moved to 9 minutes because South Asia has a nasty surprise. 14 years after joining the ranks of the countries with nuclear weapons, India carries out a series of nuclear tests that, wait for it,
wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, Wait for it.
Wait for it.
It catches the U.S. intelligence community completely and totally off guard. And these tests provoke worldwide outrage and tensions heighten when Pakistan holds its own tests only 3 weeks later. The bulletin calls the tests, quote, a symptom of the failure of the international community to fully commit itself to control the spread of nuclear weapons, end quote. Russia and the United States continue to serve as poor examples to the rest of the world. With a combined total of more than 7,000 weapons still aimed at each other. And guess what? All 7,000 of those could be ready to launch within 15 minutes. 7 minutes on the clock in 2002 when new worries and new weapons arrive on the scene. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the United States expresses increasing concerns about nuclear weapons falling into the hands of non-state actors. Because we don't concern ourselves with state actors, I guess. A top concern, though, is that an enormous amount of unsecured and sometimes unaccounted for, wonder how that happens, weapon-grade nuclear materials are still present throughout the world. The United States expresses a desire to design new nuclear weapons because why not? Especially ones that can destroy hardened and deeply buried targets, although we don't have a clue where they're at. It also rejects a series of arms control treaties and announces that it will withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty that it had signed with the Soviet Union in 1972. In 2007, 5 minutes to midnight because of North Korea rising as they conduct a nuclear test. And many in the international community worry that Iran is also working toward a bomb of its own. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, the United States and Russia remain ready to wage nuclear war within minutes. In 2010, 6 minutes on the clock because there's hope after Copenhagen. Is that tobacco? No, it's a country, Copenhagen. Just before the start of the year, a breakthrough occurs at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. Both developing and industrialized countries agree to take responsibility for carbon emissions and to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. Washington and Moscow enter talks for a follow-on agreement to start, and they plan negotiations aimed to further cuts in the U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals. The bulletin writes, quote, we are poised to bend the arc of history toward a world free of nuclear weapons, end quote. I like the glass is half full kind of thinking. I approach my coffee with that every day. 2012, desperately seeking solutions, the clock has moved to 5 minutes. Ridding the world of nuclear weapons, harnessing nuclear power, and managing the profound disruptions caused by climate change, they seem to be a little complex, and they seem to be interconnected endeavors that the world's political processes have not fostered well. Just when I had hope. The rhetoric of would-be nuclear provocateurs, such as North Korea's president, underlines the potential for nuclear war in Northeast Asia. Safer nuclear reactors with better oversight and training could help prevent power plant disasters. But technology-based approaches to manage climate change may not be as effective as we thought to prevent widespread hardship.
Great Scott!
In 2015, failures in leadership moved the clock up to 3 minutes. Quote, unchecked climate change, global nuclear weapons modernizations, and outsized nuclear weapons arsenals pose extraordinarily and undeniable threats to the continued existence of humanity. And the world leaders have failed to act with the speed or on the scale required to protect the citizens of said country from potential catastrophe. These failures of political leadership endanger every person on earth. End quote. Despite some modestly positive developments in the climate change arena, current efforts are entirely insufficient to prevent a catastrophic warming of the Earth. Meanwhile, the United States and Russia have embarked on massive, and I mean massive, programs to modernize their nuclear triads, thereby undermining existing nuclear weapons treaties, period. Quote, the clock ticks now at just 3 minutes to midnight because international leaders are failing to perform their most important duty, and that is ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization." End quote. In 2017, we take a half step forward towards doomsday, that is. Quote, "For the last 2 years, the minute hand of the clock stayed set at 3 minutes before the hour, the closest that it had ever been to midnight since the early 1980s. In its 2 most recent annual announcements on the clock, the Science and Security Board warned us, quote, "The probability of global catastrophe is very high, and the actions that are needed to reduce the risk of disaster must be taken very soon." In 2017, we find the danger to be even greater, the need for action even more urgent. But right now, it's 2.5 minutes to midnight. The clock is ticking, and global danger looms. Wise, I say, public officials should act immediately, guiding humanity away from the brink. If they do not, I say wise again, citizens must step forward and lead the way if our other leaders will not act wise. I say wisely. In 2018, we see 2 minutes to midnight. Quote, "The Security Board now sends a clear message that the danger is ominous and imminent. The opportunity to reduce the danger is equally clear. The world has seen the threat posed by the misuse of information technology and witnessed the vulnerability of even the largest, most powerful democracies to fall for disinformation. But there is a flip side to the abuse of social media. Leaders react when citizens insist that they do so. And citizens around the world can use the power of the internet to improve the long-term prospects for their children and their grandchildren. They can insist on facts, and they can discount nonsense. They can demand action to reduce the existential threats of nuclear war and unchecked climate change. We can seize the opportunity to make the world safer and a saner world. But what do we do with social media? We argue about the color of dresses. Guilty. In 2020, we see 100 seconds till midnight. Humanity comes face to face with 2 simultaneous existential danger: nuclear war, climate change. And they are compounded by the threat multiplier of cyber-enabled information warfare that undercuts society's ability to respond. Faced with this daunting threat, this new landscape, and a new willingness of political leaders to reject the negotiations and institutions that can protect civilization over the long term, the Science and Security Board moves the doomsday clock 20 seconds closer to midnight. They're hoping that this serves as a warning to leaders and citizens around the world that the international security situation is now more dangerous than it has ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. That takes us to last year. 2023, 90 seconds to midnight, which is what 2024 was rated as also. The Science and Security Board moves the hands of the doomsday clock forward, largely, though not exclusively, because of the mounting dangers of the war in the Ukraine. The war has raised profound questions about how states interact, eroding norms of international conduct that underpin successful responses to a variety of global risks. The clock now stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to global catastrophe that it has ever been. So the question becomes, who can stop it? Can it be slowed? Can it be ceased? Can it move backwards? Well, that's what we're going to look at over these next couple episodes of the Cold War Bunker, looking, and examining the Doomsday Clock. Thank you for joining us. See you next time, Bunkers.